I'm Maya, 26, and everything changed when my mother called me at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words through the phone. The storm had been brutal that evening, with winds that knocked out power across 3 counties. But I never expected it to destroy the roof of my childhood home. Mom's voice cracked as she described water pouring into the living room, soaking the carpet where I used to build blanket forts as a kid, flooding the kitchen where she'd taught me to make her famous chocolate chip cookies. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and join me as I share how a simple family emergency became something I never could have predicted. Growing up in the Chen household meant understanding that emergencies were handled as a family. Dad had drilled that into Zoe and me from an early age. When Grandma fell and broke her hip 3 years ago, we all pitched in for her medical bills. When Uncle James lost his job during the pandemic, we helped with his mortgage payments for 4 months. Family meant sacrifice, Dad always said, and sacrifice meant putting your own needs aside when someone you loved was in crisis. That Tuesday night call felt like the ultimate test of everything they'd taught me about loyalty and responsibility. Mom explained through her tears that the insurance company was being difficult, claiming the roof damage was from wear and tear rather than storm damage. They needed $4,000 immediately to get emergency tarps installed and prevent further water damage to the house. The contractor could start first thing Wednesday morning, but he required payment up front. Dad was apparently too proud to ask, which was why Mom had taken it upon herself to call me, her voice breaking as she apologized for even having to make the request. The timing couldn't have been worse for my own finances. I'd just moved into a new apartment the month before, putting down first and last month's rent, plus a security deposit that had wiped out most of my savings. My job at the marketing firm was stable but entry-level, and I was still paying off student loans that seemed to grow larger every month despite my regular payments. The $4,000 Mom needed represented nearly everything I had managed to save since college, money I'd been setting aside for emergencies of my own. But this was my family's home we were talking about. The house where I'd taken my first steps, where I'd hidden under the stairs during thunderstorms, where Mom still kept my high school graduation photo on the mantle. The thought of that house falling apart because I was too selfish to help when they needed me most made my stomach twist with guilt. I could hear Dad in the background during Mom's call. His voice strained as he tried to move furniture away from the leaking areas, and I knew I couldn't say no. I agreed to transfer the money that night, using my phone to send $4,000 from my savings account to theirs, while Mom cried with relief on the other end of the line. She promised they would pay me back as soon as the insurance claim went through, maybe 6 weeks at most. Dad got on the phone briefly to thank me, his voice gruff with emotion he rarely showed, telling me I was saving the family home, and that he wouldn't forget what I'd done for them. The next morning, I called in sick to work, too emotionally drained to focus on spreadsheets and client presentations. I spent the day checking my phone constantly, expecting updates about the contractor's progress, photos of the tarps being installed, some sign that my $4,000 was being put to good use. Instead, I got a single text from Mom around noon that simply said, "Contractor delayed until tomorrow. Weather's still bad." By Friday, when I still hadn't heard anything substantial about the repairs, I started to worry. I called Mom twice, but both calls went to voicemail. Dad didn't answer his phone either, which wasn't entirely unusual since he often left it in his truck during work hours. I told myself they were probably just busy dealing with the aftermath of the storm, coordinating with insurance adjusters and contractors, too overwhelmed to provide regular updates to their daughter who lived 2 hours away. It wasn't until Saturday morning, while scrolling through social media over my coffee, that I saw the first photo that made my blood run cold. My sister Zoe had posted a picture on Instagram showing off what she called her surprise kitchen renovation reveal. The image showed gleaming marble countertops, brand new stainless steel appliances, and custom cabinets that looked like they belonged in a magazine. The caption read, "When life gives you lemons, make lemonade. Sometimes the best things come from unexpected opportunities. Urge blessed new kitchen. New renovation." I stared at the photo for several minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. The timestamp showed it had been posted the night before, just 3 days after my parents' emergency call about the roof. 3 days after I'd sent them every dollar I could spare. The comments below were filled with friends and relatives congratulating Zoe on her beautiful new kitchen, asking how she'd afforded such an expensive renovation, praising her luck at finding such a good deal on the installation. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Surprise upgrade," it read, followed by a series of heart emojis. "We decided to kill 2 birds with 1 stone while the contractor was here. Hope you don't mind we used your money for something that will benefit the whole family long term." I read the message 3 times before it fully sank in. The emergency roof repair that had required my immediate financial assistance had somehow transformed into a luxury kitchen renovation for my sister. The water damage that had Mom crying on the phone was apparently not urgent enough to prevent them from spending my money on marble countertops and designer appliances. I set my phone down with shaking hands and realized I needed to see the situation for myself. The photos kept coming throughout that Saturday, each one feeling like a punch to my stomach. Zoe posted a video tour of her new kitchen, running her hands along the pristine quartz countertops while explaining how the renovation had been a total surprise that came together in just a few days. She gushed about the custom soft close cabinets, the professional-grade gas range, and the farmhouse sink that she'd apparently been dreaming about for years. The comments section was filled with praise and envy from friends who couldn't believe how lucky she was to afford such an expensive upgrade. What made it worse was watching my own relatives comment with congratulations, people who had no idea that the money for this renovation had come from my emergency fund. Aunt Carol wrote, "Your parents are so generous to help you get started in your new place." Uncle Mike added, "That kitchen must have cost a fortune. You're so blessed to have family support." Each comment felt like salt in an open wound, a reminder that everyone believed this renovation was a gift from our parents' generosity rather than the result of my financial sacrifice. By Sunday morning, I couldn't concentrate on anything else. My boyfriend Jake found me sitting at my kitchen table, staring at my phone screen with the same Instagram photos pulled up for what must have been the 20th time. "You've been looking at those pictures for 2 days, he said, setting a cup of coffee beside me. "I can see the smoke coming out of your ears." When I explained the situation, his reaction was immediate and angry in a way that somehow validated the rage I'd been trying to suppress. "They stole from you," he said flatly. "There's no other way to describe this. They manipulated you with a fake emergency and then spent your money on luxury items for your sister." Jake had never particularly liked my family, always claiming they took advantage of my generous nature, but I'd dismissed his concerns as jealousy over how close we were. Now his words echoed in my mind as I tried to make sense of what had happened. The more I thought about it, the more his characterization seemed accurate rather than harsh. The financial impact of losing that $4,000 was becoming more apparent with each passing day. I'd already had to skip grocery shopping that week, living off whatever was left in my pantry and freezer. My credit card bill was due in 10 days, and without my savings buffer, I was going to have to choose between making the minimum payment and keeping my electricity on. The anxiety was affecting my sleep, my work performance, and my relationship with Jake, who kept offering to loan me money despite his own tight budget as a graduate student. Monday morning brought another text from Mom, this one asking if I'd seen Zoe's kitchen photos and wasn't it exciting how everything had worked out. She wrote about how the contractor had suggested doing both projects at once to save on labor costs and how they'd found such a good deal on the materials that they couldn't pass it up. "I know you understand that home improvements are investments that benefit everyone," she wrote. "This way, when you come for holidays, you'll get to enjoy the beautiful new space too." The casual tone of her message, as if I should be grateful that my emergency fund had been redirected toward granite countertops and professional appliances, left me speechless. There was no acknowledgement that they'd changed the plan without asking me, no recognition that I might have preferred to keep my money for my own emergencies, no awareness that their investment had left me financially vulnerable. Instead, there was an expectation that I would celebrate along with everyone else, that I would be happy my sacrifice had resulted in something beautiful for Zoe. I tried calling Dad during my lunch break, hoping he might offer a different perspective, or at least acknowledge that the situation had gotten out of hand. When he finally answered, his voice was cheerful and relaxed, completely at odds with the stressed, desperate tone he'd used during the emergency call 5 days earlier. "Maya, sweetheart, did you see the kitchen? It turned out even better than we hoped. You should be proud that your contribution made such a difference." "Dad, you told me the money was for emergency roof repairs," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mom was crying about water damage and you needed immediate help to save the house." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted to the patient, slightly condescending voice he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "Well, yes, that was the original plan, but when the contractor assessed the situation, he recommended we address the kitchen water damage too. It made more sense to do everything at once." The explanation felt rehearsed, like he'd been preparing for this conversation. When I pressed him about the roof repairs and whether they'd actually been completed, he became vague and evasive. "Oh, that's all handled," he said dismissively. "The important thing is that we prevented further damage and improved the house's value at the same time. You always worry too much about details, Maya. The big picture is that your money went toward protecting the family home." That evening, I made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. I was going to drive to my parents' house that weekend and see the situation for myself. I needed to understand what had really happened, whether the roof had actually been repaired, and how my emergency fund had transformed into my sister's dream kitchen. Jake offered to come with me for moral support, but I knew this was something I needed to handle alone, at least initially. The drive to their house would take about 2 hours, time I planned to use mentally preparing for a conversation I'd never imagined having with my parents. I'd never confronted them about money before, never questioned their decisions or demanded explanations for their choices. The family dynamic had always positioned me as the responsible, reliable daughter who helped without asking questions, who trusted that my parents had everyone's best interests at heart. But as I lay in bed that Friday night, staring at the ceiling and calculating how many ramen noodle dinners I'd need to eat to make it to my next paycheck, I realized that dynamic was no longer sustainable. My parents had made a decision that affected my financial security without consulting me, and they seemed to expect gratitude rather than accountability. The realization that they might not have my best interests at heart was keeping me awake, along with a growing suspicion that this situation was more calculated than they wanted me to believe. Saturday morning, I loaded my car with a phone charger, a notebook, and a sick feeling in my stomach. I hadn't told my parents I was coming, wanting to see the house and the supposed emergency repairs without giving them time to prepare explanations or stage anything for my benefit. As I pulled out of my apartment complex, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the determined, slightly angry expression on my face. This was not the trusting, accommodating daughter they were expecting to see. I pulled into my parents' driveway at 11:30 a.m. on Saturday, immediately noticing that Dad's truck wasn't there, which meant he was probably at his weekend golf game with his buddies from work. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. No signs of recent construction or emergency repairs, no contractor vehicles or equipment scattered around the property. I sat in my car for a few minutes, gathering my courage and trying to prepare myself for whatever I was about to discover inside. Mom answered the door with surprise that seemed genuine, her face lighting up with the same warm smile she'd worn throughout my childhood when I came home unexpectedly. "Maya, sweetheart, what are you doing here? You should have called. I would have made lunch." She hugged me tightly, and for a moment I almost forgot why I'd come. Almost let myself fall back into the familiar comfort of being the good daughter who never caused problems. But then I remembered the Instagram photos, the casual text about surprise upgrades, and the growing anxiety that had been eating at me all week. "I wanted to see how the roof repairs turned out," I said, stepping inside and immediately looking up at the ceiling above us. "And I was hoping to check out Zoe's new kitchen in person." Mom's expression flickered for just a second, something I might have missed if I hadn't been watching her face carefully, before she recovered and launched into an enthusiastic description of how beautiful everything looked and how proud she was of how the renovations had turned out. As she led me toward the kitchen, I could hear the unmistakable sound of water dripping, a steady rhythm that seemed to be coming from somewhere near the living room. "Is that water I'm hearing?" I asked, stopping in the hallway. Mom waved her hand dismissively, explaining that they were still dealing with a minor leak, but that the contractor would be back next week to finish up the final details. The casualness of her response sent a chill down my spine as I realized the emergency that had required my immediate $4,000 contribution was apparently still ongoing. The kitchen took my breath away, but not in the way Zoe's Instagram photos had suggested it would. The renovation was stunning, with gleaming surfaces and high-end appliances that looked like they belonged in a luxury showroom. The marble countertops were real, not the engineered stone I'd hoped they might be, and the custom cabinets bore the trademark of a company I knew charged premium prices for their work. But what made me dizzy was doing the mental math, estimating that what I was looking at represented at least $25,000 in materials and labor, possibly more. "This is beautiful," I managed to say, running my hand along the smooth granite surface while my mind raced. "The contractor was able to do all this in just a few days?" Mom beamed with pride, launching into a detailed explanation of how they'd found an amazing deal on the stone, how the cabinet company had a cancellation that worked perfectly with their timeline, how everything had just fallen into place like it was meant to be. Her enthusiasm felt genuine, which made the situation even more confusing and painful. The dripping sound was getting louder as we stood in the kitchen, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. "Mom, where exactly is that water coming from?" I asked, following the sound back toward the living room. What I found there made my legs feel weak. Water was steadily dripping from a discolored patch in the ceiling, directly onto their brand new Italian leather sectional sofa, the one they'd bought 6 months ago, and wouldn't stop bragging about to anyone who would listen. The expensive sofa was positioned under a plastic tarp that was clearly meant to protect it, but the tarp had shifted, leaving one entire cushion exposed to the steady drip. The leather was already showing water damage, dark stains spreading across the cream-colored surface that had cost them more than I made in 2 months. On the floor beneath the couch, a large Persian rug that I knew they'd purchased during their anniversary trip to Turkey was soaked through, its intricate patterns obscured by spreading water stains. "Mom, this furniture is getting ruined," I said, pointing at the obvious damage. "How long has this been going on?" She seemed genuinely distressed as she adjusted the tarp, explaining that the leak had gotten worse since the contractor's last visit, but that he'd assured them it was just a temporary setback while he ordered the right materials for a permanent fix. The explanation felt hollow, especially when I noticed that the water damage to the ceiling looked old, not like something that had happened during a recent storm. As I stood there watching expensive furniture getting destroyed by the leak that my money was supposed to have fixed, I felt something crack inside my chest. This wasn't about emergency repairs or family loyalty or protecting our childhood home. This was about priorities that made no sense, about spending money on luxury upgrades while basic maintenance problems destroyed everything around them. The cognitive dissonance was making me physically nauseous. "Where's the emergency roof repair you needed my money for?" I asked directly, no longer caring about maintaining family harmony. Mom's face changed, the warm maternal expression replaced by something more guarded and defensive. She explained that the roof situation was more complicated than they'd initially thought, that the contractor had recommended addressing everything systematically, starting with the kitchen water damage and then moving to the exterior repairs. But I was looking at the ceiling, seeing water damage that clearly predated any recent storm, and realizing that my parents had asked for emergency money to fix a problem they'd been ignoring for months, maybe longer. Meanwhile, they'd spent what appeared to be tens of thousands of dollars on a kitchen renovation that had nothing to do with emergency repairs or storm damage. The math wasn't adding up, and neither were their explanations. "I need to see the roof," I said, heading toward the back door that led to their deck. From the backyard, the roof damage was obvious even to someone with no construction experience. Several shingles were missing or damaged, and I could see places where the underlying structure was exposed to the elements. But what struck me most was that none of this looked recent. The weather staining, the moss growth around the damaged areas, the way the wood had weathered, all suggested that these problems had been developing for years. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, documenting the contrast between the luxury kitchen renovation and the ongoing roof damage that was destroying their expensive furniture. Part of me felt like I was gathering evidence for a case I didn't want to make against people I loved, but another part of me knew I needed proof of what I was seeing, if only to help myself process the reality of the situation. When I came back inside, Mom was waiting in the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of cookies, the same peace offering she'd used throughout my childhood when tensions ran high. "Sit down, sweetheart," she said, her voice taking on the patient tone she used when she thought I was overreacting to something. "Let me explain how all this really works. You're getting upset over details when you should be looking at the bigger picture." The phrase "bigger picture" made my jaw clench, the same words Dad had used on the phone earlier that week, as I sat at Zoe's beautiful new granite breakfast bar, watching water drip steadily onto an $8,000 sofa while my parents acted like I was being unreasonable for asking questions. I realized this conversation was going to require backup. I was going to need witnesses, documentation, and a clearer understanding of what had really happened to my money. "I think we should have a family meeting," I said, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. "All of us together, so we can clear up any confusion about the roof repairs and the kitchen renovation." Mom's smile became strained as she agreed that was a wonderful idea, and she'd call Dad and Zoe to arrange something for tomorrow. As I drove home that afternoon, the sound of that dripping water echoed in my mind, a steady reminder that nothing about this situation was what it appeared to be. Sunday afternoon arrived with the kind of gray, overcast sky that seemed to match my mood as I drove back to my parents' house for what Mom had cheerfully described as a family discussion to clear the air. I'd spent the previous evening making notes in a small notebook, writing down specific questions and trying to organize my thoughts in a way that would prevent them from steering the conversation away from the core issues. Jake had offered again to come with me for moral support, but I knew this needed to be handled within the family first, even though every instinct told me I was walking into an ambush. Dad's truck was in the driveway when I arrived, along with Zoe's silver Honda and a black pickup I didn't recognize, which turned out to belong to Tyler, Zoe's fiancé of 8 months. I felt a twist of anxiety in my stomach, realizing that Tyler would be witnessing whatever was about to unfold. But I reminded myself that if my family had nothing to hide, his presence shouldn't matter. Mom greeted me at the door with the same overly bright smile she'd worn the day before, ushering me into the living room where everyone was already assembled around the coffee table. The scene felt staged in a way that made me uncomfortable. Dad sat in his usual recliner, looking relaxed and confident, while Zoe and Tyler occupied the damaged leather sofa, carefully positioned to avoid the wet spot where the tarp had been readjusted to catch the continuing drip from the ceiling. Mom had prepared a spread of snacks and drinks, as if this were a social gathering rather than a confrontation about financial deception, and everyone seemed to be waiting for me to start the conversation that had supposedly been called to address my concerns. "So, Maya," Dad began before I could say anything, his tone friendly but with an undertone I recognized from childhood disciplinary conversations. "Your mother says you have some questions about the home improvements. We thought it would be good to sit down together and make sure everyone understands how these projects work." The phrase, "how these projects work," immediately put me on edge, as if my concern about my missing $4,000 was due to my inexperience with construction, rather than their deception about what the money would be used for. I pulled out my notebook, which seemed to amuse Zoe, who exchanged a glance with Tyler that clearly said she thought I was being overly dramatic. "I'm trying to understand what happened to the $4,000 I sent for emergency roof repairs," I said, reading directly from my notes to keep myself focused. "Mom called me crying about water damage and said you needed immediate help to prevent the house from being destroyed. But when I came yesterday, the roof still isn't fixed, water is still dripping onto your furniture, and somehow my money paid for Zoe's kitchen renovation instead." The room went quiet for a moment before Dad launched into an explanation that sounded like he'd been rehearsing it. He talked about how construction projects often evolve as contractors discover additional problems, how addressing the kitchen water damage had been necessary to prevent mold and structural issues, how they'd found such a good deal on the kitchen materials that it made financial sense to tackle both projects simultaneously. His voice carried the authority he'd used throughout my childhood when explaining why his decisions were always correct, even when they seemed arbitrary or unfair. "But the roof still isn't repaired," I said, gesturing toward the ceiling where the plastic tarp was clearly visible. "My money was supposed to fix the emergency that was destroying the house, and that emergency is still happening. It's literally raining on your furniture right now." Mom jumped in with her own explanation about how the contractor had been delayed by weather, how they were waiting for specific materials, how these things always took longer than expected. But her words felt hollow when I could hear the steady drip of water in the background. Zoe finally spoke up, her voice carrying an edge of irritation that surprised me. "Maya, I don't understand why you're making such a big deal about this. The kitchen needed to be updated anyway, and now it's done beautifully. It's not like the money disappeared. It went toward improving the family home." Her dismissive tone triggered something in me, a flash of anger that I'd been trying to suppress since discovering the Instagram photos. The casual way she referred to my emergency fund as if it had always been intended for her benefit felt like a slap in the face. "The money disappeared from my perspective," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I sent every dollar I had saved for emergencies, because you called me crying about the house being destroyed. I'm eating ramen noodles and skipping meals because I gave you my financial security for what I thought was a crisis. And instead of fixing the actual emergency, you spent it on luxury upgrades for Zoe's kitchen." The raw emotion in my voice seemed to catch everyone off guard, including Tyler, who shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. Dad's expression hardened in a way I recognized from my teenage years when I'd pushed back against his authority. "Now you listen here, Maya. We didn't ask you for that money lightly, and we're grateful for your help. But you're not the only one making sacrifices here. Do you think it's easy for your mother and me to ask our daughter for financial help? Do you think we enjoyed having to admit we needed assistance?" His voice carried the wounded pride that had always been his most effective tool for making me feel guilty about questioning his choices. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my family's financial situation. Tyler, who had been sitting quietly through the entire conversation, cleared his throat and said something that made the room go completely silent. "I'm sorry, Mr. Chen, but didn't you ask me for $15,000 last month for Zoe's engagement party? You said it was temporary, just until the insurance money came through for some storm damage." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and I watched my parents' faces transform from defensive confidence to something approaching panic. Zoe turned to stare at Tyler with a look of horror, clearly realizing he'd just revealed something that was supposed to remain secret. "Tyler, that's not—" she started, but he continued, oblivious to the bombshell he'd just dropped. "And my mom mentioned that you borrowed money from her too, for some kind of home repair emergency. She was worried about when she'd get it back because she needs it for her medical bills." The pieces of a much larger puzzle began falling into place in my mind as I realized my $4,000 was just one piece of a systematic pattern of financial manipulation. How many people have you asked for money? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the steady drip of water from the ceiling. Dad's face had gone red, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell, while Mom looked like she wanted to disappear into the furniture. Zoe was staring at her hands, apparently realizing for the first time that her dream kitchen and engagement party had been funded by deceiving multiple family members and friends. Tyler, finally understanding that he'd stumbled into something much bigger than a simple family disagreement, tried to backtrack. I mean, maybe I misunderstood the situation, he said weakly, but the damage was done. The careful facade my parents had constructed was crumbling in real time, and I could see them scrambling to figure out how to regain control of the narrative. Mom started crying. Not the manipulative tears from the emergency phone call, but what appeared to be genuine distress at being exposed. "We deserve nice things too," Dad said suddenly, his voice defensive and angry. "We've worked hard our whole lives, raised you girls, supported this family. Maybe we got creative with the financing, but everything we did was for the family's benefit. That kitchen will increase the home's value. Zoe's engagement party brought the whole family together. These weren't selfish purchases, they were investments in all of us." His justification felt surreal, as if borrowing money under false pretenses was somehow noble when the end result was beautiful. As I sat in that room, listening to my father defend lying to multiple family members about emergencies that didn't exist, watching water drip onto expensive furniture while he argued that their deception was justified, I realized that this wasn't just about my $4,000. This was about a fundamental difference in values, about whether family loyalty meant blind trust, or whether it required honesty and respect. The meeting I'd thought would clear the air had instead revealed that the people I'd trusted most had been systematically deceiving not just me, but potentially everyone who cared about them. I stood up to leave, my notebook clutched in my shaking hands, knowing that this conversation had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I need time to think about all this," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, given how betrayed I felt. As I walked toward the door, I could hear them behind me starting to argue among themselves. Zoe demanding to know why Tyler had said anything, Mom crying about how this wasn't how she'd wanted things to go, Dad insisting that everyone was overreacting to a simple misunderstanding. The drive home passed in a blur of anger, hurt, and a growing determination to understand exactly how extensive this pattern of deception had been. Monday morning arrived with a text from Tyler that I hadn't expected. "Can we talk? There's more you should know about the money situation. I think my family got caught up in this too." The message came through while I was getting ready for work, and I had to sit down on my bed as the implications hit me. If Tyler's family had also been approached for money, then the scope of my parents' deception was far larger than I'd imagined during yesterday's disastrous family meeting. I called in sick to work for the second time in 2 weeks, something that would normally fill me with guilt about my professional responsibilities, but my mind was too occupied with unraveling what appeared to be an elaborate web of financial manipulation. Tyler agreed to meet me at a coffee shop halfway between our towns, and when he arrived, his face carried the same shell-shocked expression I'd been wearing since Saturday. He'd spent the previous evening questioning his mother about the money she'd mentioned, and what he'd discovered had kept him awake most of the night. "My mom lent them $8,000 3 months ago," Tyler said, his voice quiet and angry. "She told me your dad called her crying about needing emergency medical funds for your mom's supposed cancer scare. She was going to use that money for her own medical bills, but she couldn't say no when she thought your mom was sick." The word cancer hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my hands start shaking as I realized my parents had fabricated a life-threatening illness to manipulate Tyler's mother into emptying her own medical fund. The cruelty of that particular lie was breathtaking in its calculated nature. Tyler's mother, Patricia, had been battling her own health issues for years, struggling with the financial burden of ongoing treatments while working a retail job that barely covered her basic expenses. The idea that my parents had exploited her empathy and fear about cancer, knowing she would sacrifice her own medical security to help someone she thought was facing a similar crisis, made me feel physically sick. "There's more," Tyler continued, pulling out his phone to show me a text conversation with his older brother Marcus. "Marcus says your parents borrowed $12,000 from him last year for what they called emergency home repairs after the basement flooded. But when he drove over to help with the cleanup, your dad kept making excuses about why he couldn't see the damage, and eventually Marcus just left confused." I stared at the text messages, watching another piece of the puzzle fall into place, as I realized my parents had been perfecting this emergency fundraising strategy for much longer than I'd thought. By Tuesday afternoon, I had contacted 6 different family members and family friends, using the excuse that I was trying to coordinate a surprise gift for my parents' upcoming anniversary. What I discovered during those conversations left me reeling with the systematic nature of their deception. My cousin Sarah had lent them $5,000 for what they'd described as urgent car repairs after Dad's truck supposedly broke down while he was rushing Mom to the hospital. Uncle Mike had contributed $7,000 for emergency veterinary bills when they claimed the family dog had been hit by a car and needed surgery. The most heartbreaking revelation came from my grandmother, Mom's 78-year-old mother who lived on a fixed income in a senior living facility. When I called to chat with her, she mentioned how proud she was that she'd been able to help with my college loan emergency 6 months ago, contributing $3,000 from her small savings account because my parents had told her I was in danger of dropping out due to financial problems. I had never had any college loan emergency, had never asked my parents for help with my student loans, and had certainly never needed my elderly grandmother to sacrifice her limited resources for problems that didn't exist. Each conversation revealed not just the scope of the financial deception, but the calculated cruelty of the lies my parents had used to manipulate people into giving them money. They hadn't just invented generic emergencies. They had crafted specific scenarios designed to exploit each person's particular vulnerabilities and relationships. They'd told Tyler's mother about cancer because they knew she'd been dealing with her own health scares. They'd told my grandmother about my supposed financial crisis because they knew she'd sacrifice anything to help her granddaughter's education. They'd told Marcus about basement flooding because they knew he'd recently dealt with water damage in his own home. The running total of money they'd collected through these fabricated emergencies was staggering. Based on my conversations, I'd identified at least $45,000 in loans from family and friends over the past 18 months, all obtained through lies about medical crises, home disasters, and family emergencies that had never actually happened. The money had funded not just Zoe's kitchen renovation and engagement party, but also what appeared to be a complete lifestyle upgrade for my parents, including the expensive furniture, luxury vacations they'd posted about on social media, and dining out at high-end restaurants several times a week. Wednesday brought a phone call from Aunt Carol, Mom's sister, who had apparently been contacted by Patricia, Tyler's mother, after Patricia started asking questions about my mother's supposed cancer diagnosis. Aunt Carol said, her voice careful and concerned, "Patricia Morrison called me asking about your mother's health, but I haven't heard anything about your mom being sick. Is there something the family isn't telling me?" The web of lies was beginning to unravel as the victims started comparing notes and realizing the inconsistencies in the stories they'd been told. That evening, I received angry phone calls from both my parents, clearly panicked about family members starting to ask questions. Dad's voice carried a threatening tone I'd never heard before, as he accused me of stirring up trouble and betraying the family by discussing private financial matters with relatives. "You're destroying relationships that took decades to build," he said, his voice cold with fury. "Is your petty resentment about a few $1,000s worth tearing this family apart?" The characterization of systematic fraud as petty resentment showed me how completely detached from reality their perspective had become. Mom's approach was different, but equally manipulative, calling me later that night with tears in her voice as she begged me to stop making trouble for the family. "We were going to pay everyone back once your father's promotion came through," she said, referring to a promotion he'd been supposedly expecting for 3 years, but had never materialized. "You're making us look like criminals when we were just trying to make ends meet during a difficult time." The notion that their luxurious lifestyle represented making ends meet would have been laughable if it wasn't so genuinely disturbing. By Thursday, I had connected with most of the people who had been deceived, and we'd formed an informal group text to share information and coordinate our response. The total amount of money involved had grown to over $60,000, and several people were facing serious financial hardship because of the money they'd lent in good faith for emergencies that had never existed. Tyler's mother was postponing her own medical treatments because she couldn't afford them without the money she'd lent for my mother's fake cancer crisis. My grandmother was eating generic canned soup for most meals because her grocery budget had been devastated by her contribution to my non-existent college emergency. The most shocking discovery came from Marcus, who had done some investigating of his own after our conversation. He'd driven by my parents' house and taken photos of the luxury cars in their driveway, the expensive outdoor furniture on their deck, and the clearly visible roof damage that had supposedly been repaired with his $12,000 contribution a year ago. "The roof looks exactly the same as it did when I supposedly lent them money to fix it," he said during our group phone call Thursday night. "I think they've been using the same emergency over and over again with different people." That realization hit me like a physical blow as I understood that the roof emergency that had prompted my own $4,000 contribution wasn't just a recent fabrication. It was a recurring fundraising tool they'd been using to extract money from family members for months, possibly years. The water damage I'd witnessed, the expensive furniture being destroyed by the ongoing leak, all of it was apparently acceptable collateral damage as long as the emergency story continued to generate sympathy and financial contributions from people who cared about them. Friday morning brought a text from Zoe that surprised me with its tone of genuine distress, rather than the defensive anger I'd expected. "Can we meet? I had no idea about the other money. Tyler told me everything, and I feel sick about what they did to his mom." Her message suggested that she might finally be understanding the scope of what our parents had done, and possibly recognizing her own complicity in accepting the benefits of their deception without asking the questions she should have asked about where the money was coming from. As I prepared for what I knew would be another difficult conversation, I realized that the investigation I'd started to understand my own situation had uncovered something far more serious than personal betrayal. My parents had created a system of financial abuse that was destroying the economic security of elderly relatives, people with medical needs, and young adults just starting their careers. The beautiful kitchen Zoe had been so proud of on Instagram represented not just my stolen emergency fund, but the sacrificed medical care of a cancer survivor, the depleted savings of an elderly grandmother, and the financial stress of multiple family members who had trusted people they loved with money they couldn't afford to lose. Saturday afternoon found me sitting in Aunt Carol's living room with 8 other family members, including Tyler's mother, Patricia, my grandmother, and Marcus. All of us gathered for what we had started calling the emergency family intervention. The irony of that phrase wasn't lost on any of us, considering how many fake emergencies had brought us to this point. Aunt Carol had volunteered to host after learning the full scope of my parents' deception, and her dining room table was covered with printed bank statements, text message screenshots, and handwritten timelines that documented 18 months of systematic financial manipulation. Zoe arrived 20 minutes late, her face red and swollen from what appeared to be hours of crying. Tyler wasn't with her, which didn't surprise me given that she'd texted earlier about them having a huge fight the night before when she'd finally understood how his mother's cancer treatment money had funded her engagement party. "I keep thinking about Mrs. Morrison skipping her appointments so I could have custom cabinets," she'd written in a message that seemed to indicate she was finally grasping the human cost of our parents' choices. The atmosphere in the room was unlike anything I'd experienced at a family gathering. There was no casual conversation, no sharing of food or stories, just the heavy weight of collective betrayal and the practical urgency of people trying to figure out how to recover money they couldn't afford to lose. My grandmother sat quietly in the corner, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as she listened to the other victims describe their own experiences with my parents' fabricated emergencies. Patricia Morrison's voice shook as she read aloud from the text messages my mother had sent her about the supposed cancer diagnosis, messages that were filled with specific medical terminology and emotional manipulation designed to bypass any logical questions about the situation. She described symptoms that matched exactly what I'd gone through with my own diagnosis, Patricia said, her voice breaking. She knew I'd been through chemo, knew I'd understand the fear and desperation. She used my own trauma against me to make me empty my medical fund. Marcus had brought a folder thick with documentation, including photos of my parents' house showing that the basement flooding emergency they'd described to him had never happened, along with social media screenshots from the same time period showing them enjoying expensive dinners and weekend getaways. "While I was losing sleep worrying about their supposed crisis," he said, his voice bitter with anger, "they were posting pictures of $200 dinners and bragging about their wine collection." I felt like an idiot for believing them, but also furious that they'd played on my genuine concern for family. The financial impact assessment we'd compiled was devastating in its scope. Beyond the $60,000 in direct loans, several family members had taken on additional debt to help with the supposed emergencies, including Patricia putting her medical bills on credit cards and my grandmother borrowing against her small life insurance policy. The ripple effects of my parents' deception had created financial stress throughout our extended family network, with people making sacrifices and taking risks they couldn't afford, based on lies about crises that had never existed. As we sat in that room documenting the scope of the damage, my phone started buzzing with increasingly frantic calls from my parents. They'd clearly realized that their victims were comparing notes and organizing some kind of response, and their messages shifted from defensive justification to desperate damage control. Dad's voicemails evolved from angry accusations about me betraying the family to increasingly panicked promises that they could work something out if everyone would just calm down and be reasonable about this. The most disturbing revelation came when we started comparing the specific medical lies my parents had told different people, They hadn't just invented one fake health crisis, they'd created an elaborate mythology of ongoing medical problems, complete with fabricated doctor appointments, non-existent test results, and detailed descriptions of treatments that had never happened. Mom had apparently told Patricia about chemotherapy sessions that matched Patricia's own experience.